Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to November's meeting of Human Rights and Equalities Board. My name is Paul Grady. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, and I co-chair this board. The other co-chair is Councillor Katie Lomas, and we take it in turns to chair the meetings, and this particular one fell on my watch. So I'm delighted to be chairing this. It's the first meeting that we've ever had of this board, which has been public, so it's an event, and I'm very pleased that you could join us. A little bit of background: this board in its current form was constituted in 2013, and it consists of members of the executive, members of political parties in the city, statutory bodies and other key stakeholders in the city. And its main role is to raise the profile, really, of human rights within the council, but also more broadly within the city. One of its roles is to consider the recommendations that are made in this report, an indicator report on human rights, which is produced every year by the York Human Rights City Network. Now, the network is a collection of civil society and community groups within the city, which is co-hosted by York CVS and by the centre where I'm based at the university. And this meeting is the first of what I hope will be many in terms of setting up a procedure for how this board addresses particularly the recommendations within the indicator report. So the report each year comes up with a series of recommendations. And what we'll be doing from now on in this November public meeting is to publicly address those recommendations. And the discussions and documentation that are collected here will then feed back into the next indicator report, so that there is a kind of completion of that circle. Recommendations made one year will be reported back on in the following year. So that's what we're doing today. The report from the York Human Rights Network report from last year had a number of recommendations, and we're focusing on 3 today. So the meeting is divided into 3 sections, which I'll just talk about very briefly. One relates to the pay gap. One of the indicators that we've reported on annually is a gender pay gap, which is high in the city. But the recommendation for this year encouraged us to think not just of the gender pay gap, but also other related pay gaps related to race, disability, and the intersection between these different pay gaps. So that's the focus of the first set of discussions that we'll have today. The second relate to healthy life expectancy. And again, there's very significant inequality in the city relating to life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, depending on where you live. And the recommendation for this year was to try and explore what a human rights-based approach to addressing healthy life expectancy might be able to contribute to ongoing strategies that are happening both at a council level and nationally. And then the final recommendation we're looking at relates to perceptions of human rights in the city. In 2 years' time, it'll be a decade since York declared itself a human rights city, so it seems a good time to at least start a discussion of the extent to which the ways in which human rights are used and understood within the city, and we'll have a presentation from the police to kick that off. So under each of the 3 recommendations, we have a short presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. For those of you who are online, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and Katie's keeping an eye on that. And you can put those questions in while people are speaking so that they get first call when there becomes an opportunity to ask them. Those of you who are in the room, just raise your hand, basically, and I will call on you. In terms of how you operate the mic, you need to, those of you who want to speak just need to press the tab, helpfully labeled mic in front of you. Make sure that you speak close to the microphone and don't turn your head away. Those of you who are sitting in the rows towards the back, there is a traveling mic, or you can choose to come and sit at a chair near the front to use the mic. So there's an opportunity for everyone to take part in this. Just a little bit of housekeeping then before we start. The toilets, if anyone needs to use the loos, are out the back. Similarly, if there's a fire alarm, please follow the council staff out the same exits towards the back. I think I've more or less covered the mic etiquette. Please turn your mic off once you've stopped using it. And with that, I think I'm done. Oh, yes. And when you're either presenting or asking a question, could you please introduce yourself so people can know who you are? Are there any questions about what we're doing here, what the order is, structure of the day? No? Gary.
When are we going to deal with the minutes of the last meeting?
That's not, we don't do that in this meeting.
Oh.
Sorry. Reach the rule immediately that Paul put it in place. We don't do that. This is our one annual public meeting. So we'll be looking at ordinary business of HREB at the next HREB meeting.
Right. So the action points have got to wait 6 months before they're accepted.
The action points will still be being followed up on. If there's anything you want to ask about, please, contact myself, contact Laura. We can give you feedback, but we don't want to use our time in this public meeting going over ordinary business because we want this to be a more interactive discussion.
Any other questions? Yeah, no, okay. So if we move on then to agenda item 2, which is summary of the pay gap data from partners. So Laura Szwazowski, I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes.
Is going to introduce this item for us. Laura.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm Head of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion here at CYC, and we asked partners to share with us their pay gap data. So I'm going to be reading what's on the slides and having a general discussion around them as well. Just waiting for them to move. Here we go. So I thought a reminder of our what the Human Rights Indicator report said. So over the past few years, we have highlighted the significant gender pay gap in York. We called for increased efforts to address this issue, as well as other workplace inequalities in York, such as ethnicity and disability pay gaps. In order to begin to tackle these inequalities, it's important to understand the reasons why they exist. Next slide. We then talked about our recommendations. Just waiting for the slide, sorry. There we go. We recommend that the Human Rights and Equalities Board press for research to be carried out, which seeks to identify the specific factors behind the gender pay gap in York. And we recommend that the council, statutory bodies and other employers publish data on additional pay gaps. So I just wanted to remind us of what the indicator report said. In terms of York overall, in 23, we saw a relatively significant decrease from 20.2% from 20.2%, sorry, from 24%. Disappointingly, in 2024, this figure rose to 22.6%. It's important to note that the gap in York was 9.5 percentage points higher than the Yorkshire and Humber, 8.5 percentage points higher than England, and 9.5 percentage points higher than the UK average. So what I've done here with this table is take it literally from the government website and have a comparison of the gender pay gap, hourly pay mean, and the hourly pay median. So you can see that the City of York Council is at -1.8 and -1.6 respectively. Minus actually means that it's in favour of women. And then for North Yorkshire Police, we can see it's 6.6 and 17.2 approximately for the mean and median. And University of York is 15.3 and then 13.7 and so on. I'm now going to just talk a bit about what we found in terms of the data across other pay gaps as well. Sorry, I keep forgetting to press the button. So when it comes to the council, we did publish our disability pay gaps and our ethnicity pay gaps as well. So as you can see there, it's 5.1% mean and a 3.8% median for disability. But again, it's worth declaring that the number of staff actually telling us they have a disability is very low. So 7% of those staff that we analysed. And then the mean ethnicity pay gap is 7.6 and the median is 2.9. And again, the number of staff declaring their ethnicity other than white is low as well, at only 3.3%. So when we compare that with residents, for disability, we know that 17% of our residents are disabled, and then 7.3% of York residents are from other ethnicity groups apart from white. So I think it's worth, again, keeping those in mind. York College were able to share their gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gap, and disability pay gap, which you can see there are quite consistent. Oh, I'm so sorry. There they are. So you can see that they're similar to what we've just seen from the council, although a larger ethnicity pay gap. York St John were able to give us slightly more data, so their gender pay gap is 12.1 mean and 18.6 median. I should have explained at the beginning, when we talk about the mean, we talk about the average, and when we talk about the median, we're talking about a midpoint in the pay scale. Ethnicity is minus 4.7 and disability is 4.6 as well. So that's from recent data. And I think, again, there are challenges around staff declaring their disability and ethnicity. Asham Brian, we have a minus gender pay gap and under the mean, and the ethnicity is estimated at 3.5%. Again, there needs to be more data. And disability is 4.1% that we can see there. University of York have gone a step further and have separated out their ethnicity by groups of those individuals who identify as Asian, Black, mixed or other. And you can see in the table there that we have quite significant differences. So for Asian, the mean is 11.2%, but for Black, it's 21.3%. Mixed and others are quite consistent at around 10%. And then when we look at disability, it's 7% for the mean pay gap. And Tees, Esk and Weir Valleys shared their data with us as well. NHS Foundation Trust shared their data as well. And we can see there that gender is around 11%, disability 3.4%, and ethnicity is minus 12.8%. I did look into this in a bit more detail because I thought that was quite fascinating. And there is a low proportion of Black and ethnic minority staff at the Foundation Trust, but those a lot of those individuals are concentrated in the medical professions and thus slightly higher paid than the average. So that's why the pay gap the mean pay gap works in a positive way. And when it comes to the median, it's actually quite significant. So this is where having a comparison of the mean and median is very helpful, because again, that median is the midway point of the pay scale. So in terms of analysis of this, because there's an awful lot of data I've just thrown at you, I think what's significant is if we look at the gender pay gap, if we look at male-dominated areas of work, such as the police, then the figure can be higher. So for example, there was a higher collection of women in the lower quartiles in North Yorkshire Police. And we know that some of the causes of the gender pay gap relate to occupational segregation. So women are concentrated in roles in the caring sectors, in clerical and catering and leisure sectors, for example. And these can be lower paid areas of work. Women are also 3 times more likely to work part-time, and the roles that lend themselves to being part-time, sadly, are often in the lower paid areas as well. So there's different reasons why the gender pay gap exists. Not least equal pay discrimination is also a reason. And then when we looked at ethnicity and disability pay gaps, and the data is still emerging around that, we did see a higher rate of declaration is needed. That was a common theme. And I think staff confidence in being able to declare that they have a disability or ethnicity is really key here. But it does give us an indication of where measures are required and where they're needed. And again, some of the causes of ethnicity and disability pay gaps do relate to discrimination, but it can be also related to occupational segregation, and it can be related to the allocation of work and projects, individuals being overlooked for promotion for lots of different reasons. And I think the other thing that struck me was that we could potentially learn from those organisations that had a 0% or had minus gaps. There may be some positive learning, but that again is why it's crucial to look at the median as well as the mean, because they're a very useful indicator. I think that's everything I was going to say. Megan's going to talk from KPMG, is going to talk a bit about what they've been doing around pay gaps and talk a little bit about some of the measures that they've done to address the pay gaps as well.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Meg Murray-Smith. I work at KPMG in the UK. I'm a senior manager in our Inclusion, Diversity and Equity, or we go by IDE, team in the UK firm. Just to build, I guess, on what Laura said, I was going to spend a bit of time today giving some perspective on the pay gap reporting we do in our organisation, our journey with it, the different pay gaps we report and why we report them, but more importantly, some of the steps we've taken to try and address it. Sadly, we are not one of the organisations with a 0% pay gap, but hopefully there's still something useful to take away from today's session. For those who might not be familiar with KPMG in the UK, we're a partnership organisation. We have about 17,000 colleagues across the country. We're a professional services firm, so we provide audit, legal, tax and advisory services to clients, not just in the UK actually, but internationally as well, across both the public and private sector. So, a little bit about what we report. I'm going to draw our attention to the bottom of the slide first. We first started publishing our gender pay gap back in 2015, so it's been about 10 years now that we've been reporting that figure, and that was ahead of the legal requirement to do so. And since then, in the last 10 years, we've been on a journey of increasing our transparency around pay gap analysis. So we shortly followed by publishing our ethnicity pay gap, and then in 2020, published a specific Black heritage pay gap, as well as our disability and sexual orientation pay gaps. A year after that, in 2021, we became one of the first organisations in the UK to publish our socioeconomic background pay gap. And then in 2024, we provided additional breakdown data in the ethnicity pay gap, similar to the University of York data that Laura just presented. That's a lot of pay gaps, that's a lot of work, that's a lot of data, that's a lot of analysis. So why do we do it? Firstly, because we can, and we think it's important. We have the benefit of quite a large data set. So building on Laura's points around the importance of disclosure, we're between 75 and 85% declared across our 17,000 colleagues across the UK. So that's a big data set for us to work with. And this is important. And so it's important that we look at this, and it's important that we then publish it. So to pick on those 4 key reasons as to why we report so many of our pay gaps. Firstly, transparency. We're a regulated industry. Being transparent is a really important part of our overall approach, but it holds ourselves to account and it helps us measure long-term progress. Secondly, consistency. Our strategy in the UK firm on inclusion isn't just looking at gender, so our pay gap analysis shouldn't just look at gender. We should look at the full suite that we're able to report on to bring that intersectional perspective and to bring that consistency. Thirdly, we're a consultancy firm. We consult other people on how to do their pay gap reporting. So we should do our own pay gap reporting and do it well, and lead by example, provide that credibility we can in the market, and help kind of lead the industry forward on the importance of reporting this data and understanding it. And finally, but obviously most importantly, is the impact it provides. It allows us to, through holding ourselves to account, properly interrogate the data, measure the impact of the activities we're putting in place, and see what's working. So our gender pay gap in more detail, I should start by saying this is our median basic pay gap, excluding equity partners. It's just one measure. We report a lot more on our impact site, if anyone's particularly interested, on our website, but I thought I would pick one that we've been doing the longest. I also reference it excludes our equity partners. We're a partnership organisation, so we have, I think, about 400 or 500 equity partners who are technically owners of the business, and therefore under the government kind of requirements of how you calculate your gender pay gap are not included. However, we do include them for a different version of our pay gap that is on our website. But I thought I'd stick with this because this is probably the most applicable across other organisations. So I guess, what does this show us? Well, firstly, for the eagle-eyed, sorry, I missed the 2016 and 2017 data points. I wasn't in the firm at the time, and I couldn't find those numbers when I was preparing this slide deck, but it doesn't distract from the overall point I was trying to make through presenting this data in this way, which is that you get the most value understanding what's working on your gender pay gap looking long term, because it fluctuates and there's a lot of things that impact it. You can see here over the last 10 years, we've had about a 5 percentage point reduction. That's not a lot. It's been hard work to get that 5 percentage point reduction, and we've still got a way to go. But what's particularly interesting is the dip we saw in 2020. So to Laura's point, the construct of our organisation and what causes our pay gap is the median woman in our firm sits at an assistant manager level, whereas the median man sits at a manager level. So we're comparing an assistant manager salary to a manager salary. And that's ultimately at a very high level what's causing these percentages. In 2020, we just nudged into having both those median colleagues at the same pay grade. They were both at the same grade. And then in 2021, we dipped back out. So I guess the summary here is it's fluctuating, a lot can impact it, and it changes quite a lot over time. So I would encourage you to look not just in year-on-year changes, but your overall kind of long-term changes. And also, I guess the final point being, we know it's still big. We're not here to say we've fixed this, and there's still a lot of work to do. Which I guess brings me to, what are we doing? What have we done? And what are we trying to do? I wanted to start, before I talk through a very blue slide that I've put up there, that I have a colleague who often talks about the pay gap with the kind of iceberg analogy, that it's the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that sits underneath it. There's no one silver bullet that will directly impact your gender pay gap. There are a number of measures that will indirectly impact your pay gap over time. It's a very important measure. Obviously, we believe that, given we report so many of them, but it is just one measure. So it's important to look at everything else you've got available to you around it to really understand that context. So to talk through what we have been doing directly and indirectly to try and address our pay gap, this is our UK firm's inclusion strategy on a slide. It's called our KPMG A Fairer Future for All, and everything that we do is to focus on building 3 core outcomes as outlined at the top. So everything, every activity, every decision, we ask ourselves, is it going to help us achieve one or hopefully more of our 3 outcomes of an inclusive environment, accountable leaders, and equitable experiences? On a practical level, that means we work across several strategic pillars as outlined on the middle, which I will come to in a moment when I talk through some particular examples that I think might be of interest. Just moving to the third section underneath, for me, my client is the business. I work for the business. So our plan is informed by the business, by the people who it impacts the most. So we work in partnership with a number of different communities across our firm. To call a couple of them out, we have a few kind of consultancy boards that either are internal and external, not dissimilar from the meeting today, that we work closely with. We also have 16 employee networks, or ERGs as others may call them. And then, of course, work closely with our HR teams and other people function centres of excellence, all underpinned by our values. So looking at the strategic pillars, what we've been doing that we think has indirectly impacted our gender pay gap over time. Starting with leadership and culture, this is where that outcome of accountable leaders is really important. We've done quite a lot of work to make this mean something for our leaders, to make this something they think about. It's easy to make big public statements, to say the right thing, to say that we believe in making this better, but how do we make that something that we are all collectively working towards? So in the last few years, we've introduced a number of inclusion measures into leadership scorecards, so directly impacting how our leaders' performance is rated and therefore how they're paid. And the gender pay gap is one of those measures. So even though they have no direct influence over, one decision isn't going to make a massive difference to the gender pay gap, they have a collective responsibility and therefore it's on there. And I think that's an important signal and tone from the top to set. I also just wanted to call out under leadership and culture, every year when we publish our pay gaps, we will do a session with the colleagues impacted by that particular one. So for example, in the gender pay gap, we will do an event, often headed by at least one ExCo member, to our women's network or anyone who wants to join, really, to provide a lot more detailed data, so data by grade, for example, or kind of seniority level, to create that culture of transparency and openness internally as well as externally. Secondly, under fairness in systems and processes, I guess a couple of things I would call out, and Laura touched on one actually around kind of project allocation and work allocation. In an organisation like ours, that's how it works. You get allocated onto a particular project. Some of those projects can be career enhancing, career defining, the ticket to partnership if that's what you want. So we've got a big project underway to make sure that how that process is happening is fair. And it's not just, oh, I've worked with them before, they were really good, let's work with them again, making sure we're equitably allocating those opportunities. Flexible working or agile working is a key part of that as well. We've got some quite exciting work going on around job sharing at senior levels. We think that's a really interesting opportunity for an organisation like ours. We don't have a successful job sharing partnership at a senior grade in the client-facing part of our business, but that could open up a whole new way of working and really open up the opportunity for more women specifically to get into senior roles. And finally, in terms of fairness, in the last year, we've made some enhancements to our maternity, paternity and shared parental leave. There's some really interesting research coming out of other European countries that can directly correlate extra weeks taken when a new child is born by the second parent to overall reductions in the gender pay gap. So that is an important measure. Moving then into our talent buckets, we've got everything from talent acquisition, how we bring people into the firm, talent management, kind of promotions, etc., and talent development through the learning space. We have some good activity happening in the acquisition space, but actually that makes our gender pay gap a little bit worse. And it's a short-term pain for long-term gain is how we think about it. So in a firm like ours, we bring in thousands of students every year into our graduate schemes, and they tend to be slightly over proportionate from a gender perspective. So about 54% female. That means we're bringing more women into our junior grades, and that actually worsens our gender pay gap at that point. But we believe it's the right thing to do. The talent's there. If we focus on progression in the long term, we will start to see that pay off, but it is not a short-term fix on a gender pay gap. But we still think it's the right thing to do. Under talent management, I wanted to call out some research we did a few years ago, which was quite interesting, looking at progression rates through our firm. So we took 10 years worth of data and measured the average rate of progression by all diversity characteristics and intersectionally. And actually what it showed us is that colleagues from a low socioeconomic background face the biggest barriers to progression. And that was kind of worsened, if you like, when it was intersected with gender. It's a public report, it's really interesting, but what it helps show is progress we made over time. So we could show that we'd actually reversed a previous progression gap for women. So when we first did the analysis, it was a -8 percentage point progression gap. Women were progressing on average 8% slower through our firm. And then through a number of programs like talent programs, kind of really focusing on ID data through promotions, etc. When we next ran it, it was a 2 percentage point positive gap. So we had reversed a progression gap that had existed. And all of that is helping build our representation at senior levels, which in turn will help our pay gap. I guess I'll just close by quickly calling out, we have mandatory inclusion learning. This is something that matters to everyone in our organisation. We see that through the scorecards. We make everyone do mandatory inclusion learning. Taking 30 minutes every 2 years out of your day doesn't feel like a lot, but that's 30 minutes more for a lot of people that they probably weren't thinking about it. So that we have seen that be powerful. And then finally, because I don't want to miss it out, we have a box called Our Collective Voice. I guess similar to something like today, we believe we have a responsibility as a large employer to advocate on this topic, to share our own experiences, learn from others. We sponsor a number of really important initiatives, like the FTSE Women Leaders Review, and so on, which are kind of helping push this agenda forward across society more broadly. I'm going to pause there because I know we really wanted to have time for discussion, but available to take any questions specifically on anything I've shared as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura and Megan, for the content, but also for keeping so nicely to time. So we have 20 minutes to discuss this. We can open it out now to the floor and online. I guess maybe let me start, Megan, by just asking, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but looking at the data that was presented around York, was there anything in particular that you thought that struck you, that you thought was interesting or challenging or problematic?
I think I always think it's funny when I see a 0% gap. I'm always like, how on earth did you do that? Exactly to 0%. So I'd always be interested in the data behind that. Look, I mean, ultimately nothing surprised me. It's such a, as a measure, I think to the point I was making earlier of it being one measure in the tip of the iceberg, it's really reactive to a number of things that you might not be that big of an issue. So for example, our overrepresentation of women coming through our student programs is a good thing, but made our pay gap worse. So, I mean, we did a whole exercise 2 to 3 years ago where we did a really deep interrogation of our pay gap data because it was around the years where it wasn't moving at all. And our ExCo commissioned a piece of research. We spent about 6 to 8 months working with our client-facing team who work with clients on this to really, really understand exactly what was causing it, which is a really hard question to answer, and what we could do about it, and ultimately get ourselves comfortable with, we think we've got the right strategy in place. We think it's going to take time to see that come through on the gender pay gap.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Sorry, maybe just, there's a microphone coming.
Firstly, a comment, a suggestion. The organisation of this room is awful. The audience has to turn by 180 degrees and is unable to see the speaker. So that might be improved because there's a visual gap for the audience. A question for Megan. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You mentioned that you had a large database of clients, and therefore from that database, are you able to share with us any inferences on gender, race, disability pay gaps in those organizations, and what sort of areas those organizations subtend, and what sort of geographical areas they subtend?
So I'm just going to interrupt there. Could you try to bring the microphone closer? It's really difficult to hear in this room unless you use a microphone. So if anyone's speaking, don't be afraid of the microphone. Pretend it's an ice cream that you're about to eat. That's the best guidance anyone ever gave me about using a microphone.
I repeat the question. Megan, thank you for an excellent presentation. You did mention you have a large database of client data, and therefore from that client data, could you share with us, wherever possible, the gender, race, disability pay gaps in those organizations, and whether or not they relate to the area in which those organizations work, and also any relevant geography?
I'm not sure, sorry if it was I misspoke, but we have a large database of colleague data that allows us to do it. But I can, I guess, give one perspective that might be working towards, I think, what you're alluding to. And it's less to do with our pay gaps as such, although there will be an element to it, is the geographical spread of our colleagues. And therefore there are different pay bandings. If you work in London, you're on a different salary than if you work in York, Manchester, Scotland, etc. And how much a difference in representation will be impacting the pay gap. When we've looked, because this was one of the things we did look into with our own pay gap, when we did that deep dive I referred to, when you get specific, if we're looking at a particular pay gap within a particular, say like our manager population, you do start to see those geographical differences have an impact. For us, when you roll everyone up into 17,000 people, it didn't have so much of a direct impact on that number, but when we did the broken down versions, it did. I think for us, the biggest difference we see geographically is an ethnicity representation. That's where we see the biggest variance, and less to do with the pay gap. But an interesting point that's always stuck with me, when we think about our Black heritage representation, the majority of our Black heritage colleagues are based in London, but that is the only part of the country where we are not representative of the city we work in. So actually, even though our number is the highest, if you like, in London, we're the furthest away from being proportionate to the city that we're in. Everywhere else we are actually proportionate, the numbers are just lower.
And do those employees live in areas, for example, as Paul alluded to for York, in areas which have low health outcomes?
That is a really good question that I don't know the answer to,
Thank you.
I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can everybody hear me? So
Sorry, I should have said
really
also
made that
should-
worthwhile. I was interested in your
Sorry,
comments
would you mind
about,
just introducing yourself
Sorry,
as well?
Ben.
Sorry, I should have said, if people could introduce themselves before they make.
okay, yep. Councillor Ian Cuthbertson, member of the Liberal Democrat group on the council. Thank you for the presentation. I was very interested in your job share at senior levels. And I wondered, I didn't quite get how long you've had it, have you had it working? And I'd like to ask one or two questions about the sort of arrangements for getting people into this job share situation. First of all, is it restricted to senior levels or kind of upwards from there? Presumably not including equity partners. Secondly, are job share posts allocated as a result of application rather than management decision? And thirdly, is there a conscious attempt to have a set number of percentage male or female, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can take that one on our job share. If I'm really honest, it's early days. It's always been an option technically under our policy, but it's happened in junior roles. Often in our secretarial group, we have a lot of really successful job shares. We, even though you can technically do it, are seeing it not happen because it's too hard in senior roles. So that's why we're now trying to do a project to try and work through those barriers that colleagues are facing. We are trying to get some equity partners to do it. We're running into a lot of barriers, but we're trying. That's what we want to try and see if we can make it work for people. Currently, it's allocated based on personal choice, not management decision. So if individuals are wanting to explore that job share, we will try and find them someone else with a similar, who could do a similar role to do it with together, which is also really difficult to do. And currently, no, we don't have a target percentage. We'd like at least one equity partner job share if we can, and to kind of hold a partnership hand through the experience to see how it works with all sorts of operational things like risk and sign off on clients, etc., when you've technically got two people responsible for it. But not many people are doing it, which is why we're trying to do it. None of our direct competitors are. The people we work with, Job Share Revolution, was set up by two ex-finance directors who job shared at ASDA. So they had a successful senior job share, and they've got some really good experiences to share, and we're going to try and make it work in a partnership.
That's very interesting and potentially rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen and then Gary.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for two really interesting presentations. And listening to them, I was beginning to wonder what the data is saying, because there seems to be a disconnect between the research that we've got and the figure that we've got here in York. So, you know, particularly it looks as if in the public sector, and York Council with a negative gender gap anyway, clearly is doing something about that. And many of the other organizations are relatively low level, and yet we're seeing that it's over 22%. I mean, I think only maybe the police with 21% came anywhere near what the average is. So the question is, where is this gap in York, and what's is it to do with? And the second question is, what can the council or what can the Human Rights and Equalities Board do about that?
Stephen, could I ask you just to quickly say?
I'm sorry, Stephen Pittam, I'm part of the York Human Rights City Network.
Thank you. You want to come back on those?
Hi, Laura here. I don't know if I would describe what I did as research. We asked our partners on email to share data with us, and I quite literally put some figures in boxes. The truth is, I don't know what is making the overall for York percentage as high as 22%. I think we might need to do some more extensive research looking at, you know, the large employers that we have here within York. And as you say, the police is one indicator, but there are other sectors. So the construction engineering sector has a massive pay gap because it has massive occupational segregation. Other occupation, male-dominated occupations can explain it as well. So I'm sorry, I don't have a clear answer to that one.
I think Councillor Lomas would like to come in on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Katie Lomas, and I'm the Council's Executive Member for Human Rights, Equalities and Inclusion, amongst other things. It's a really interesting question, Stephen, and I think we've talked quite a bit about how we've ended up in a position where the council, which is a reasonably big employer in the city, has a negative pay gap in favour of women, and yet overall the city has such a large pay gap that's out of step with the region. And I think there's an interesting difference between public sector organisations, which tend to be more highly unionised workforces, and other sectors where there is less or different levels of unionising through their workforces, because of course trade unions really hold employers to account for pay decisions and for pay parity, and you are far more likely in a unionised workforce to have pay scales, to have decisions on pay being made in a transparent and open way that everyone can access, rather than decisions made on an individual basis behind closed doors. And I think that drives a lot of that difference. We also in York, we know that we have a reliance on a lot of precarious and lower paid work. So we have a lot of hospitality related work in the city, and much of that is precarious, much of it is lower paid. And so that also, I think, drives differences in our pay gap. And it is absolutely something that we need to look at as a city. And that means everyone across the city, all the employers across the city, looking at what we can do, and what we hoped to do through this initial focus on this is to really share some thoughts about where pay gaps come from, and what different organisations are doing about it. And I'm really grateful to Megan from KPMG for coming and talking so honestly about how pay gaps arise, and also what KPMG, a huge employer, are doing to try to address all of their identified pay gaps, which is really important. And I just wanted also to pick up on the job share question that Councillor Cuthbertson asked, because I think job share is a really important way to open up more senior roles to people who cannot commit to full-time working. But I also am a big fan of opening up part-time working. Job shares are really difficult because you're essentially asking two people to have one mind in a job, and that can be very challenging, especially in those much more senior roles. But actually opening up and saying, we could have somebody part-time in this role. We could have somebody work part-time in this role, and other aspects of that role could be given to another part-time worker. We could divide this role up instead of asking two people to kind of merge into one. Let's look at dividing roles. Let's make part-time working okay at senior levels. And I think that would be a huge way of addressing pay gaps in many organisations, because it is by far the most likely that women will need at some point to work less than full time, because it's women who are far more likely to carry the burden of responsibilities outside of work. So I think job shares are great, but opening up part-time working is even better.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lomas. Yes, got time for one more question, and Gary's had his hand up for some time.
Thank you. Gary Craig, I'm representing Inclusion and Equal Rights UK, the anti-racist organisation in the city. The answer broadly to Stephen's question is that a lot of data is missing, and a lot of data we've got is not worth having. I'll just give two examples. The data that is missing, Councillor Lomas has already pointed to the business sector. We wrote to the 100 largest private sector organisations in the city in terms of the size of their workforce, asking for data on the ethnic composition and distribution of their workforce. Only 2 of those 100 companies responded, and they both told us to mind their own business. It was nothing to do with us. They won't publish the information, and there are huge discrepancies in pay and conditions within many of these companies. We know that for a fact. You only have to look at the industry statistics in terms of something like accidents and so on. So the vast majority of people who are employed in York, we don't have the data. In terms of misleading data or incomplete data or simply useless data, Laura, and nothing I should say should be taken as an argument for saying this is an important work to do and to be pursued. But Laura mentioned, I think with approval, the instance of York University, which had broken down its data into white, black and Asian. Well, if you think about the Asian category, that groups together people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin on the one hand, who on every metric that we have are low achievers, low income, low educational attainment and all the rest of it, with Indian and Chinese origin people who are on any metric very high. So stick those 4 together, what do you get? You get a meaningless average across 4 groups who are extremely different in terms of their economic and educational profile. So I think the message for Laura is when she's going back to these organisations saying thank you very much, they should first of all break those categories down into something meaningful, and then to encourage all the other organisations to follow the example of the University of York and break the categories down, not just the workforce as a whole. The NHS is a very interesting example, the Foundation Trust. You know, there's a complete bifurcation between, on the one hand, consultants who are highly paid, who are generally found in surgical and high medical professional status, and the people who are very low or untrained nurses, cleaners, caretakers, and the low-paid jobs, who are more likely to be black African or Pakistani, Bangladeshi. And again, you know, conflating all these categories together really doesn't give you data which is of any use whatsoever. And I imagine Megan might actually underline that from her own experience. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to quickly respond to that?
I would just echo to say it's a continual challenge with sensitive data, using it in a way that's helpful and informative to all of the points you've just made, but also in a way you need enough data to be able to do that in order to protect people's data as well. So it is a really fine line and a hard balance, but where you can disaggregate, you'll get a truer picture if you can get to a lower level.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm not going to neatly encapsulate how I think we're going to respond to all of this, but I mean, I think the problem of getting data beyond the public sector is one that certainly we've struggled with a lot in terms of the indicator report, or certainly getting detailed information. The importance of disaggregating data, but also how you do it. I mean, Gary's point, it's not enough just to disaggregate. It has to be done in useful and thoughtful ways that actually tell you something. And also just frankly, the difficulty of understanding the data. I think each year when we come to look at the gender pay gap, it's not self-evident, it's not straightforward. There's a lot of depth and complexity to trying to interpret what's going on. So having said all of that, it's clearly incredibly important that we keep trying to do all of these things across all of the different characteristics that we've talked about. But I have a feeling we're really right at the beginning of a journey, aren't we? And we'll be returning to this at subsequent meetings. But thank you particularly to Laura and Megan for the inputs on agenda item, 3. I think we now need to move on to agenda item 4, which is healthy life expectancy. And Pauline is going to introduce this item for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pauline Stutchfield, Director of Housing and Communities, and I'm actually giving a presentation for somebody else today. I will try and answer any questions a bit later. So I'm representing Peter Roderick, who's our Director of Public Health. Just moving on to the first slide, if you like, our challenge around this particular area from the indicator report very much focuses on how the board can bring together organisations to discuss how human rights informed approaches can contribute to making York a healthier city and reducing the gap in healthy life expectancy between the richest and poorest communities in York. And I just point to the wording around healthy life expectancy. Life expectancy is that totality of good and poor health that a person experiences and their age from birth to death. Healthy life expectancy is, as you would expect, the element of that age that you spend in good health. And that they're the disparities that we're going to talk about next. So if I go straight to the graphs there, hope you can read them. This is life expectancy, total life expectancy in the city, split between those that live in the least deprived, 10% of York's population, the York average, and then the most deprived, 10% of York's population. And you won't be surprised to hear that in totality there's an age difference of 10 years between those in good health and those in poor health in our deprived areas. The stats from the indicator report said that the healthy life expectancy for men in York decreased in 2024 from 63.61 years to 62 years, so that's a 1.5 year difference. It changed in 1 year, and for women that decrease was even greater. There is no good news from the indices of multiple deprivation that were published last Thursday. Health and life expectancy in York has decreased even further, and it's probably something the network might want to pick up in the next indicator report, that this situation is not improving. These are some of our inequalities in the city, and down in the bottom left-hand corner you can see that split between the life expectancy statistics that are quite old now actually, but are, as we've just heard, worsened, where the gaps are bigger for women, and the overall gap is 10 years, as I mentioned. And as you can see, 1 in 9 of our children live in poverty in the city, and 1 in 8 residents live in fuel poverty. Just an indication of how many of our residents actually are affected by poverty. So what we're trying to draw here is a direct correlation to then health outcomes for our residents. So challenges into older age. So the box on the top left-hand corner is working age challenges. Going into then the bottom right-hand corner, which are the challenges for our older people, which you can see there's some that are the same, but in terms of some of those basic rights around housing affordability, that's a challenge for everyone in working age, but particularly those in poverty. And you can see some of those challenges in older life around being able to access basic services because they're digitally excluded, or they're lonely, or they have no access. Again, those inequalities changing but increasing over the life course. So how can we use human rights approaches? So some of you might have heard of the panel approach. So applying principles such as non-discrimination, participation, accountability, equality, empowerment, and legality. These approaches enable people and organisations to address underlying determinants of health, such as poverty, inequality, and discrimination. And we've just heard about addressing pay gaps that can directly impact on a person's outcomes. If we can address pay, we can, in working age individuals, we can directly impact on health outcomes for them. But in general, this is about having a person-centred approach around the service delivery from across our sectors, shifting the balance of power so that healthcare is more of a partnership with our residents, and they're fully involved in the development of our services. So how do we do that in York? So we have an independent collection of partners who are called the Health and Wellbeing Board, and some people sat around the table and in the audience are part of that. And they have developed the health and wellbeing strategy in the city. And some of those members have directly declared that they will take action to ensure that a human rights approach through involvement will be driving their priorities. And you can see there a quote from York CVS, who are represented today, who have directly said, we will ensure this approach is key to the way we work going forwards. So what does it mean if we involve residents in our services from the very beginning? Obviously more person-centred around their needs, improved decision-making, broader range of currently excluded groups are involved and considered, hopefully all, and more meaningful engagement. It means that we are listening and then doing and then feeding back. And it was interesting listening to Megan, making sure that we're accountable back to those residents for what we're doing. So my presentation isn't as long as the other ones, but just trying to show you some examples of where we think this has worked really well, but happy to be challenged by that. So the co-production that's gone into developing our mental health hubs in the city, very much focused around the needs of residents. And we have something that every health and social care system has in the country currently, Health Watch, who engage and give a voice to service users to challenge back to the independently the health and social care system. However, as we know, the funding for Health Watch is coming to an end. So one of our key tools that enables us to have a human rights approach is actually potentially disappearing. So I think that's a real challenge for the city. And any gaps where a human rights approach would add value. I've been involved in the Poverty Truth Commission work in the city, which has put our residents' voice at the forefront of designing change, to which they are now seeking to hold the decision makers in the city to account, but who has adopted the standards that they developed and who's put them into practice. So some of the things that we've done in the council are, for example, we've built the organisational standards into our practice model for our new neighbourhood model, our new way of working within communities, which is going to be heard by executive tomorrow evening. We've formally adopted the standards, and that was done earlier this year across all of our systems and processes. And it's a fundamental approach in our approach to setting priorities in our anti-poverty strategy, which again is going to be heard by the executive tomorrow evening, which is all great to hear. I'm sure you'll say that's brilliant, that ticks a box. What it doesn't do is make change, and it doesn't hold us accountable. So I guess the challenge for us is how are we going to then ensure that we do listen to people and make sure that they are involved in and driving service design going forward, and particularly our neighbourhood model. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that was my last slide, yes.
Thank you, Pauline. We have time for discussion and questions now. I guess just a quick thing for me is I think in particularly in relation to socioeconomic issues, some of the frameworks that exist relating to human rights, of which the panel principles are one, are a kind of common sense, aren't they? And in a way, for all of us, it's a reminder of that common sense, and which allows us, I think, to do two things. One is to acknowledge that, I mean, this council and many of us are doing a lot of that stuff because it is the right thing to do, because it seems normal and sensible, and but it also allows us to highlight areas where we're not perhaps doing something that, when it's pointed out to us, seems very obvious and commonsensical. And I'll give you a very early example of this. An earlier version of this board wanted, on the back of an indicator report, to do some work on NEETs, those not in education, employment and training, which was, the numbers absolutely were not high, but proportionally it was higher than comparator cities and the national level at that point. And one of the things that became clear was that there was lots happening in the city on NEETs, but that the actual participation of those who were NEET or had been NEET wasn't very central in any of these interventions. And so the board commissioned a piece of work where their voices were central, and then backed that with some money for interventions that, for a period of time at least, made quite a significant impact on the number of NEETs in the city. The numbers came down. And when you point that out, it seems really obvious for NEETs to participate in schemes that were affecting them, but it clearly wasn't happening to the extent that it should do. And actually involving their voices made a significant difference. So, you know, for me, it's a very good example of this kind of human rights as common sense, which both acknowledges things that we're doing, but also enables us to shed light on things where we could do better. Flick Williams has a question online. Would you like to raise it herself, or?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Unfortunately, I think it's quite evident that the statistics about life expectancy and healthy life expectancy are only going to get worse as we go forward. We are, you know, still in a pandemic, and the issues for many people, you know, continue, even if they're not, you know, readily associated with COVID. The research reports, you know, are now coming out thick and fast to show the long-term damage, particularly from repeat infections. But you know, we're up against it because I have tried to, you know, engage in various different meetings that have been addressed by the Director of Public Health, you know, about those issues. But also there are things that, you know, I appreciate are beyond the control of the council that are taking us in the wrong direction. For example, the changes in eligibility for patient transport, coupled with, you know, 22 months since the demise of Dial-A-Ride, as reported by Healthwatch, you know, many disabled and older people are now not attending health appointments because they simply can't get to them. So, and similarly, you know, the government has now insisted in its 10-year plan for NHS England that people will be required to engage with work coaches in medical settings, which is also another major disincentive, particularly for those in mental health crisis, to actually seek medical help. So, it's more of a comment that really than a question, but I just don't see what is going to happen that is going to turn the tide around. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. Do you want to respond to that, Billy?
Yeah, I hear all of that, and I agree. I think what we've got to commit to as a city is make sure that our decision making, whatever our decisions are about provision of services, is very much informed by a human rights approach. And hopefully you'll see going forward that we are building alongside the Applied Centre of Human Rights work, applying human rights approaches to our decision making by using a tool that we've developed in the council, and we've got 38 champions now trained across the council to be able to help service managers eventually be able to think about human rights issues first and foremost, rather than at the end of decision making, which is where we're still struggling with things. So I'm really interested in KPMG's approaches about instilling equity approaches throughout their leadership practices, and this is where we need to get to be. So I'm not saying we can change the world, but at least if we can put human rights at the forefront of residents, at the forefront of our decision making, then we're going to get the best we can out of our decision-making processes.
Thank you. Abhijit?
Thank you for your presentation. Sir Michael Marmot's review of health inequality in London is now 15 years old. The repeat review is now 5 years old. In other words, pre-COVID. These health inequalities are independent of COVID, for the avoidance of doubt. I very much was taken that we can be observers, because the remedies that have been suggested are downstream to the health inequalities, essentially of deprivation and poverty. You do not cure deprivation and poverty by mental health hubs. And therefore, I put it to you that we are, as you said, as you alluded to earlier, observers rather than doers.
Councillor Lomas, or Councillor.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in a lot of the things that we as a society need to do to address poverty and deprivation, you're absolutely right. The council we do not control the levers for a lot of that. However, we do provide services to people across the city, and we do have control of how we provide those services to people, and embedding human rights, embedding inclusion, embedding our anti-poverty strategy, which is, as Pauline said, goes to executive tomorrow evening, making sure we adopt the Poverty Truth Commission's organisational standards in the way we deliver those services to the people that need us most in our communities. That's the way we can change what we can do. We can only observe what is happening in decisions about, Flick mentioned the decisions about changes to eligibility for benefits. We can't do anything about that, but we are looking at ways that we as a council can respond to the potential impact that those changes may have. And we've had cross-party scrutiny, working with our financial inclusion steering group, looking at what are the potential challenges that people in York are going to face as a result of the changes to come, and how do we respond to that? For example, when the eligibility for winter fuel allowance changed, we immediately set about making sure we reached out to people that we knew may be eligible for pension credit. And that eligibility for pension credit opened up eligibility for a winter fuel allowance payment. And we retasked council staff to directly engage with those residents, go out, find them, speak to them, help them make their applications. And that's had an impact that's gained residents living in York thousands and thousands of pounds of additional payments now and into the future for them. So we are able to do some things that really make a difference. And I firmly believe that for those people that we got pension credit payments and winter fuel allowance payments for, that will genuinely have made a difference to their health outcomes over the last year. And we continue to do that, and we continue to target the services that we do provide to those people that we know need them most. And for example, we made decisions about how we share out our ward funding. So in the past, ward funding's been shared out due to the number of councillors in a ward. So in my ward, where we have 2 councillors, we got less than the next door ward, which has 3 councillors. And instead of doing it on that basis, we now share it out with under a complex calculation of the level of deprivation in a ward, so that we are targeting even funding like that, even funding that goes to small organisations, voluntary and charity sector organisations doing small things very locally in wards. But we even target that on the basis of deprivation, so that we can be sure that wherever possible, we're putting our money and our services where it's needed most. And I think that's all that any of us can do. But I think it's also important that we do it working together. The council is not the only organisation in the city, and we're very clear that we need to reach out and build partnerships, and our financial inclusion steering group is a great example of that, where we bring people all over the city together who are doing things to help people with financial inclusion, and we seek to bring people together to work together to get an even better outcome for residents than would happen if we all individually worked in our own little silos and didn't talk to each other. So I agree on many of the things that we are observers, but there are things that we can do to respond to what's going on around us.
Thank you. One more question, I think, yeah, Denise.
Hello, my name's Roger Tuckett. I'm late diagnosed autistic. I run an organisation called the Yorkshire Adult Autism Self-Advocacy Group. We're talking about life expectancy, but one group that has a markedly lower life expectancy are autistics, adults. Not just those with learning disabilities, but generally. The data, the studies are very recent. 2 years ago, I think there was a major study on it from University of London, and very more recently than that, one on ADHD and the life expectancy deficit from that. Just a couple of observations. One, that there's an assumption almost that the only 2 reasons for this disadvantage is poverty or deprivation, but autism ADHD doesn't necessarily fall into that at all. I mean, autistic people don't get jobs. It's one of the lowest employment rates of any group almost. So they tend to be poorer, but it's genetic, basically. So just a word of caution of relying solely on poverty and deprivation as a measure. Certainly, I think York is wonderful to have a new autism ADHD strategy adopted in this room, in fact, about 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, can't remember when, which certainly embraces a societal approach to the need to embrace society. And again, a sort of general observation to make, that human rights approach sort of talks about a legal right, whereas if you are socially isolated and have no contact, you need your neighbour to invite you to his or her social gatherings. You can't really legislate for that. There's no right. I mean, I go further and say this is a moral imperative. I just invite people to reflect on that human rights has this suggestion of legal rights and yes or no and black and white, but that many of these things, society needs to embrace these difficulties. People with health inequalities, I could start about that and the implication of that, but those are the points I'd invite the group to reflect upon. Thank you
very much. I think it's important it is a very important point to make that human rights doesn't include all of morality. that there are a very specific set of tools, and that there are things that are morally right to do that don't necessarily fall. Denise's hand was up first. Okay, we've got 2 minutes. Denise, do you want to say?
Denise Cargill from the Green Party. Absolutely acknowledging what the previous speaker just said. I'd just like to go back to the poverty and deprivation point. I just wanted to come back on that a little bit. I totally agree with the point, obviously, that underlies a lot of the issues that you're trying to address. And I also agree and support a lot of what Katie talked about in what she said in response to that. But the bit I just wanted to question you about was that we can't do anything about what is happening nationally. And I might have misunderstood what you were saying, but you seem to be saying that increased poverty and deprivation is almost inevitable, and we just have to do what we can because we know the council isn't well enough funded. And I just wonder how that relates to the role of this board now. You know, you're a partnership, you're a cross-party partnership and cross-organisation partnership. Surely you have a lobbying role vis-a-vis the politicians and the people who make those decisions that can help to address deprivation and poverty at the level that we know a lot of it needs to be addressed. That was my question.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to go to Ellen for a question and then maybe 30 seconds each to wrap up.
Really confusingly, my point goes back to Roger, sorry. I wanted to sort of take what he'd said and fully acknowledge that and just broaden it a bit in, not in terms of life expectancy, but quality of life. Being disabled has in whatever way, has a big impact on your quality of life unrelated to your impairment because of access to things like healthcare. It's just not equal, I guess. And also just to tie this all in a nice big ribbon, being disabled also then increases your risk of living in poverty. So it goes full circle.
I'll be really quick in response to Denise. What I meant was we don't set rates of benefit. We don't decide on eligibility to benefits. Of course, there are many things we do to try and influence, but we don't control those decisions that are made. I was trying to get across that we can influence, and certainly only last month I was at the Labour Party conference talking to lots of people about the impact of cost of living on residents in York and beyond, and we absolutely try to influence, and we work together to try to have the biggest influence we can, but ultimately we don't control those decisions. And so our responsibility as a council is to respond to what we know is happening and to work together cross-party, across HREB, across the city, to respond and do what we can to get the best possible outcomes for our residents, despite decisions that are being made all of the time in lots of different places, whether those places be the NHS, whether they be government, whether they be private companies, other organisations. We can't control them. We absolutely do try to influence them.
Yeah, Pauline.
Thank you, Pauline again. And just to carry that on, part of our response in the city across the whole health and social care system is to develop the York neighbourhood model, which I think is a first in the way that we're doing this very much together. And we're talking to Ed with the police. We've got the schools clustering in the neighbourhoods to bring services and partners and the voluntary and community sector, or everyone in the community close to residents, so that they can access what they need as locally as possible and as early as possible in an early intervention and prevention model, because that's what's going to impact on someone upstream. That's what's going to make a difference. And so we want to ensure that everybody's got their person. So if there's one learning that I took from the Poverty Truth Commission is we have too many contact points. They're disparate. People have to explain themselves time and time again. We need to stop that, have one point of contact where somebody can have faith in that individual or that organisation to bring services in, and that's where we want to be. And so hopefully we can turn that tide, we can have that effect what happens upstream, and we can improve quality of life. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Just by way of conclusion, there is a group of postgraduate students at our centre who's doing a piece of work on this, specifically the rights-based approach to healthy life expectancy. So I will feed all of this back to them and hope they come up with something beautiful for our indicator report. Thank you. Let's move on then to our last agenda item, number 5, which is perceptions of human rights. When we first started working on the idea of York becoming a human rights city, the profession in the city that was clearly miles ahead of everybody else in terms of understanding human rights was the police. Police had a very, or certainly senior levels in police had a very sophisticated understanding of human rights and talked at many of our early events. So under the umbrella term of perceptions of human rights, we've asked Superintendent Ed Hayward Noble to come and kick off the discussion. So thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Pauline. I'm Superintendent Ed Hayward Noble. I am the Commander for York and Selby, and also I'm a trained public order, public safety, that's the acronym there, POPS, Silver Commander, which means that in the world of public order and public safety, when we're having either protests or events, etc., I'd be the tactical level commander who would basically run the operation from a public order, public safety side of things. So I've got some experience in that world, and human rights is a massive part of that when we're coming up with our plans. Engagement with partners as well is a significant part of that. This is outside of the public order, public safety arena, but I'd really welcome Pauline's comments around the new neighbourhood model, certainly for my teams. Ryan is sitting next to me, who leads on neighbourhood policing in the City of York. We're fully supportive of that, really welcome it. It's got the potential, I think, to be really transformational for the way that we are serving the public in our communities, and the key element of that is a partnership bit. So I'm fully welcome that and support it. I'll move on though through my presentation. Basically what I've got is just a bit of background and context about the Human Rights Act. Thank you for those kind words. I like to think that we've got a bit of an understanding of human rights. I'm particularly focused on the protest side of things for the purposes of today, because that's where really human rights comes to the fore. So just a bit of background and context about the Human Rights Act, and then the practical application of that, how we then apply that on a day-to-day basis, particularly in the context of protest. So basically, the European Convention on Human Rights from 1998, brought in under the Tony Blair's government, means that all public authorities, including the police, must act in a way that is compatible with the Convention on Human Rights unless primary legislation requires them to act otherwise. And we're talking very extreme circumstances when that will be the case. There's a theme here, though, that runs through everything that Megan said in her presentation. Paul is on life expectancy as well, which is common to our approach as well. And it's all about fairness. And that's really what the Human Rights Act delivers. It's a way of putting that into a legal framework, but it means that we're obliged to consider a range of human rights in our decision making. So then we're taking the best possible decisions, balancing people's human rights, keeping people safe, which is obviously our primary purpose as the police, but also considering the full range of human rights. And as that second point says, we have to consider a range of human rights issues all at the same time, and then it's about finding that balance between them. So the key human rights articles, again, I won't go through them in any sort of huge detail. Article 2 is the right to life. That's the one that trumps everything, really. I won't read them all through, but the most key ones to when we're talking about protests are Article 8, which is the right to respect for private and family life. Article 9, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. 10 for freedom of expression. And then 11 is assembly and association. So 9, 10, and 11 in particular are relevant for people coming together to voice an opinion and protest about a particular issue. So some of the rights are absolute. That means that they can't be interfered with unless it's that we can't balance the absolute rights against these of other individuals. So right to life is the really the main one for that. There's that exception there in relation to deaths resulting from lawful acts of war. What's equally important is that we've got a positive duty to act as well under Article 2 as public authorities and the police in particular. So if we see that there's a risk to life, we are positively obliged to act to minimise the chances of that person coming to harm. So that's really key to that one. Limited rights, these can be limited in explicit and finite circumstances, which are set out in the article itself. So Article 5 is liberty and security. If that was an absolute right, that would basically mean that we couldn't arrest anybody and deprive them of their liberty. But there are circumstances when we need to do that. But they are particular prescribed circumstances set out in the article, including arrest under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. That would be the primary legislation for that. But also detention following conviction by a court, which is obviously, some people, when they break the law, we have to keep them in prison for rehabilitation and also to keep the public safe. Qualified rights then, these can be restricted by the state in order to protect the rights of another or the wider public interest. That's got to be in accordance with a prescribed law. That's the important point. So public safety, when we're talking about that, etc. So there's got to be a reason for us to interfere with the qualified rights, and that's got to be proportionate to the legitimate aim that's been pursued. So what we're talking about here is things like within the law, the police under the Public Order Act, we have got the opportunity to put restrictions on protests. So we can, for example, in certain circumstances, we could put a limit on the number of people who could attend a protest. We can put time limits on it as well. We can put geographical limits on it as well. But that's got to be fully justified. And there's got to be a reason why, and we have to explain that as well. So if, for example, there was going to be a protest next week in St Helens Square with maybe like 2,000 people coming, we might say that's too many people for the space to accommodate. It's dangerous. Therefore, we need to limit the numbers. To do that, we'd work with the organisers. We have specialist trained teams called protest liaison officers who in advance will engage with the organisers of a protest. And it's about keeping everybody safe primarily, while enabling people to exercise their rights around expression, assembly, and thought, freedom of thought as well, I have to think then. There isn't a specified or defined right to protest as such, but the right to protest, if you like, comes from 9, 10 and 11. Those are very much at the forefront of our mind when we are thinking of, considering protests and working. It is all about working with the organisers as long as they're willing to do that. That is very often balanced with Article 8. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, protests can be very disruptive in certain circumstances. It can be very noisy. It can also hinder people's passage around an area. So again, if it was in St Helens Square on a Saturday afternoon, people are going about the daily business shopping, that kind of thing, or socialising, could be hindered by it potentially. So it's a case of factoring that in as well, that while people have got the right to protest, other people have got the right to go around their daily business as well. And businesses also, under Article 8, have got the right to conduct their business. So, we've got to consider that as well. And everything needs to be proportionate, legal from us and justified as well. So this is moving on to the point about applying the Human Rights Act, particularly in the context of protest. So we use a national decision model. At the centre of there is a code of ethics. That's when I talked about fairness at the start. That's about doing what's right. In summary, what would the public expect us to do in these circumstances? I get that there are different views, the public, different groups, people have different views and opinions and ideas. It's about really doing what's right morally. So there's 5 stages to the national decision model. I won't read them all out, but it follows that cycle round. Every time we get new information or intelligence, we'll spin the model again and do a reassessment so that our decision making is fully aligned to the latest data and information. So that is what underpins all our decision making when it comes to planning for protest. It promotes an operation that's proportionate to risk. That's why we use that model. And the Human Rights Act is considered in the powers and policy section, along with the other relevant legislation, which could be the public order legislation, for example. This is just a quick example. When we had the party leaders debate at York University last year before the general election, the threat triangle, it's just to illustrate really, we consider victims, subjects and locations. So that's just to give it an example of the detail really that we go into when making those considerations. And then again, this is how we would do those ratings really, low to medium for most of those ones, but it's just to illustrate the kind of process that we follow and the detail that goes into mapping out this decision making. So tactical options, then we've got a range of them that we'd use. What we tend to do, I'll come on to this, we start at low level because that is what really underpins human rights. We don't want to be moving up the, going in with too high tactics. It's things like we've got public order policing. I talked about the protest liaison officers at the start. They are a tactic to us in advance, as is warn and inform. So that example around the protest in St Helens Square, what we might do if we know that there's going to be a gathering there, we might put some information out in partnership with, say, the BID and with the local authority to let people know that it's happening so they can plan their activity around that, they know about it. So things like warn and inform in advance are tactics as well. And then it moves up the scale to things like having the officers out if we need them in uniform with different types of kit and equipment, depending on what the threat and risk is. But we'd always make sure that that would be proportionate. There are certain of the higher end tactics that we'd never use in a sort of standard protest because they just wouldn't be proportionate to that. Communication's key to it. Really important to follow this model. This is what we always do. It's about listening, empathising, asking questions. So we've got that full understanding of what's going on and we understand everyone's viewpoints as well. So we can build those in. Paraphrasing, in other words, just summarising what we think we've heard, just to double check that we're right at the end. So this is, for example, what the protest liaison team would use, but it's also applied generally in policing as well. It's a model that we teach all our officers to encourage that two-way communication so that we've got a sense of people's views, opinions and needs when we're taking our decisions. So this is really the graduated approach that we'd take in a protest situation. And I'm thinking in this situation, for example, where we've got people breaking the law. So they're causing an obstruction, for example, on the highway for whatever reason. They're hindering people going about the daily business. So if you think about maybe Just Stop Oil or something like that when they're on the motorways, that was a classic example from recent years. So instead of going in heavy-handed and sort of dragging people away, we'd start with a simple appeal, asking them to comply with what we'd like them to do. In other words, move off the motorway. Then we make a reasoned appeal, explaining why we're asking them to do what we want them to do, what law they might be breaking. And then the personal appeal, just talking about the implications of their actions for them, for the wider community as well, the risk as well that comes with that of arrest. And then the final appeal, this is about basically saying, is there anything that I can do to reasonably get you to cooperate with us and with what we want you to do? So you can see it's structured. It's not just a case of going in and being heavy-handed with people as a methodology that we follow, so that people have got that opportunity to engage and have a voice. Getting towards the end now, I talked about the different tactics that we've got. Basically, there's 10 principles of use of force. I thought I won't go through them all. It's quite rare, really, when we have to use force, particularly in a protest situation. Certainly here in York, you do see it around the country. In other areas more than we do here. Generally here, when we get to protest, it's very constructive, collaborative, people make the voice heard, and everyone disperses afterwards. But you do see force having to be used around the country. But generally, we'd use non-violent methods before using any use of force. I mean, I'm talking about use of force. That could be handcuffing somebody. I'm not talking about necessarily drawing batons or anything like that. It could literally just be putting hands on somebody, moving them away out of a particular location. It could be handcuffing them as well. And we have to, it's really important that the minimal force is used to achieve what it is that we want to happen. And all this is documented and recorded as well. And audited really closely. Any time that force is used, it's subject to scrutiny by ourselves internally, but also externally. And then lastly, these are the guidelines that we follow for use of force if we are going to have to, say, start putting hands on. Is there a lawful objective to that? We've got to be satisfied that there is. Is there any other means of using, any other means other than using force to achieve the lawful objective? So that might be going through that 5-step appeal, for example. Or it could be, so using the example on the motorway or on a, where there's people blocking the motorway, could we divert traffic round instead? Is there a different way that we can achieve what we want them to achieve? So we think about all that in detail as well. And then it's using the minimum level of force necessary to achieve the lawful objective and making sure that's proportionate and not excessive, because ultimately what we don't want to do is start interfering with people's human rights when we come to things like, well, it would be Article 5 on torture, that would be the relevant one for this. That's everything that I had, really, but I'll open it up then for any questions that people have got on that.
Brilliant, thanks, Ed. Yeah, so we have probably 20 minutes yeah, Gary.
Well, can we take a real life example? What have the police been thinking and doing in relation to the flagging campaign? Our experience has been that minoritized communities, and indeed many other communities, have been quite terrified by the appearance of all these flags and the sense of feeling and emotion behind them. So what have the police been doing? What's their stance? And what are they planning to do? The flags have not gone. Go down Haxby, it's like confetti on some of the high streets in Haxby. They're still there. They're very intimidating. They're quite frightening.
Yeah, I'm hearing loud and clear what you're saying, and that's something that we've heard, from engagement with our communities as well, that people do feel intimidated by the flags. What I would say is, for the police, we don't tolerate hate crime in any circumstances, and so when hate crime is reported to us, I can reassure you that any hate crime is fully investigated. If we can identify people responsible for a hate crime, then we will deal with that. We'll arrest them, bring them to hold them to account, bring them to justice. There was one flag that was hung on the city walls, probably, sort of 6-8 weeks ago, something like that, that had offensive language on it, and that we deemed that to be a hate crime. The person responsible for that was arrested and was, I think the investigation's ongoing at the moment into that one, but that one is one that we're dealing with. In terms of the wider issues with flags, again, it's the council have been doing an awful lot in terms of removal of flags. I know that they've taken a position of that and on that, and they're taking the lead on the removal of flags. And I know that I've had regular meetings with Pauline and colleagues and also with councillors on that. And they've been working really hard on the removal of flags, and it's around, there is a plan for that to be done over time. I know other people that the people who've been putting the flags up will replace them on occasion. There are groups as well who are going down independently and taking the flags down. The police's role will be, if there's conflict between groups, then we'll step in and deal with that. If we get reports of hate crime, if we get reports of people being intimidated, threatened with violence, then we'll come out and deal with that. But we're not there to remove the flags. Let's say that's the council that are leading on that. But in that process, should there be, let's say, hate crime committed, instances of violence or threats of violence, then they know to call us, and then we'll come out and deal with that. There's a whole load of work as well that's ongoing through our community teams around engagement with communities, dialogue, to give that reassurance that we'll deal with hate crime, and we don't tolerate it. I don't know if you want to talk about any of that, Ryan, the work that...
Can I just ask, I mean, why is it not the police job to remove the flags or to require that they are removed by the people who put them up if you regard them as tantamount to a hate crime? I mean, you would stop somebody punching somebody in the face as a physical act. Are not the appearance of flags tantamount to that sort of action? May not be so directly violent, but they are a form of hate crime.
So the flags, and I'm assuming that you're talking about the St George's flags and the Union flags that are going up or that have been put up here in York and around the country as well.
Yeah.
That in itself, putting up a flag is not a hate crime, and it's not classed as a hate crime, and we don't regard it as a hate crime. When there's offensive language on it, which we've had a couple of occasions when we've seen that, then yes, those are treated as a hate crime. I do get loud and clear though the perceptions that people feel intimidated by it, but actually putting up a flag in itself does not meet the definition or the criteria of a hate crime. Do you want to talk about the engagement bit?
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Chapman, the MPT Chief Inspector for York and Selby. So, like Mr. Haywood-Noble's just said, the perception of the flag, we're fully aware of that different people have different views on what that flag presents to that group. So what we've been doing, working particularly close with the council and other partners as well, is doing that community engagement, going out to speak to different partners and different groups across the city to reassure them and to work closely with them so that we do have proactive patrols and engagement events across all sectors and all faith groups. It's something we particularly did A, with the flags, B, when we did have some race hate incidents in the city that you will have seen and heard about, and we again did that community engagement, particularly with the mosque. And then following the tragic incident in Manchester, again, we worked very closely with the Jewish community and again with the university as well, which has a large community Jewish student population, and again work closely with them. So we are actively going out and speaking and working with those groups. And what I'm really keen on is it not being police-led, but police engaging with those communities and working together to find a common solution, because we will not always have the answers and we will not always have the right answers. So it's really important that we engage and listen and work together on these issues.
I don't know if you have seen, but the York Human Rights City Network put out a statement about the flags, which, I mean, it takes a very clear kind of position on them. But I mean, I guess what's interesting about the flag case and the protest case is that human rights don't, in a very simplistic way, resolve the issue for you. They frame a debate, right? There's rights on different sides of a discussion. And then, so it doesn't take away from you the need to make a judgment call, but it frames what that judgment call is, basically, doesn't it? And does so in rights terms, which I think is, you know, there's the blue badge issue is another example here, that kind of issue. And so there's been a lot that have affected the city quite directly where, and we felt on the flags that framing it in rights terms was a useful way of trying to, I guess, trying to move beyond a very, very polarized set of positions, whilst ourselves still taking a position on what should happen. So I guess on most of the decisions that you have to make of that kind, where you are, or the difficult decisions where you are basically balancing different rights and still having to make a judgment call, but framing them in rights terms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary of where we're at, really. I mean, just to talk through, for example, you know, if a call comes into us, the process that's followed, it'll come into our control room, whether it's a 999 or a 101, and that'll get picked up by a call taker in the control room. And they'll put it through a process that's called Thrive, which is threat, harm, risk, engagement, vulnerability is the V. And this is how they will assess, basically, do the initial assessment for what the level of risk is. And then it'll be graded based on that, either I, which is immediate, P, which is priority, or we have O grades as well, which is an appointment. So if it's an I grade, if when they've done that initial assessment, the level of harm requires an immediate blue light response, then that gets put to the top of the queue. We've got finite resources, as of all agencies across the city and across the country. So it's just to give that reassurance that we've got processes there to prioritise our attendance at the incidents where's the highest risk. So what does that mean in terms of human rights, and particularly around the flags? Well, it means that we will obviously, if in terms of prioritisation, if somebody's at risk of immediate harm, then we will be there with our resources, and we'll prioritise that. But it's just, we have a lot of competing demands as well across the city. A lot of things like domestic abuse, for example, violence against women and girls, right at the top of our list of priorities. And ultimately, if somebody's at risk of harm, then we're going to go to those jobs or to those incidents as a priority, and we'll get to the other ones as quickly as we can. And which, as you rightly said, human rights frames all our decision making, and that's really the initial decision, that triage in the control room, with Article 2 underpinning that in terms of the right to life, and us getting to the incidents quickest, where we can basically save lives and keep people safe.
Thank you. I guess I've just got one other question then. I mean, the agenda item is around perceptions of human rights, and I guess the extent to which human rights is part of people's everyday lives. And I suspect, frankly, if we talk to most people in the city, it's not. So I just wondered, from the experience of the police and engagement with the Human Rights Act, and the fact that at least, it does seem to, for at least some, be very central in the way in which you make decisions, even if perhaps you come to different conclusions to some of the other people here about how to proceed. Would there be any lessons that you might have for, I guess, other groups in society, other professional groups, other communities, in terms of how you've managed to, how's that process happened?
That's a really, really good question, and I wouldn't presume to kind of give any lessons to anybody, but I think things have evolved in policing over a number of decades from where we were. Maybe the relationship with minority groups going back historically was not good, and so we've had to act to change that, and that's framed around human rights. Things in the public order arena, such as Hillsborough, for example, that's made us completely change our approach to policing those type of events and human rights as well. So I wouldn't want to necessarily give any advice to other partners or groups, other than really it's all about learning from what's happened in the past, and being really open and honest about that. I think that's the really important thing, to have open and honest conversations, reflection. Don't try to cover things up. Don't try to stick to the narrative that's maybe been ingrained for years and years. You've got to be open and transparent. Otherwise, decision making isn't going to improve, and have a real honest reflection about mistakes that have been made. Policing's made mistakes in the past. I think everyone's aware of those. We also get it right a lot of the time as well, and I think we don't always talk about that as much. But there's an awful lot of positive outcomes that we get in terms of, say, safeguarding, partnership working, keeping people safe as well. But we don't hear about that quite as often. But it's just about having a learning culture, being open-minded, and just for us, it's about remembering about our core mission around keeping people safe from harm, and remembering that we're here for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. Police are here for absolutely everybody. It doesn't matter, I say who you are, how long you've been in the UK for. Everyone gets treated exactly the same in the eyes of the police, and I think that's something that's worth mentioning as well. Did you want to come in, Ryan?
Yeah, just on that, something that we've introduced into the police in the last few years is what we call a structured debrief. So I'm one of those trained officers in that, but what we do is particularly certain events that we will have had, we will bring not only the police but partners in together to really kind of drill down into what worked well, what didn't go so well, and really kind of drill that learning from it. And the Human Rights Act is at the very heart of that when we've gone that. So I would suggest that's been a real useful tool for different parts of policing itself and with partners when we've brought them into that as well.
Thank you. Denise.
Oh, all right, thank you. I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to raise something which I think fits. I hadn't realised you were going to speak about this in this section, but I think it does fit with what we've been talking about, potentially linked to protests and to what happens in our city centre. I expect you're aware of the public space protection order that the council has been consulting on, and I think is going to a decision on the 2nd of December. And I support the principles of continuing what we've had before in terms of street drinking, etc. But I'm very concerned in a human rights context about the 3 additional proposals for the city centre. And I don't know how much members of the board are aware of this, but I think it's very concerning when you have phrases like under begging, any kind of begging action could be anyone is likely to cause harassment, alarm, distress, nuisance or annoyance. And then that phrase is used again under a right to exclude people from the city centre for 24 hours. And that person, again, you know, it covers a lot of things, can't remain within the city centre and mustn't return for 24 hours, doesn't say where they're going to go, what the consequence is going to be, what the impact is going to be. And then a third one on loitering, again, using that phrase, but no person shall loiter, sit or lay on the floor or on temporary structures in or adjacent to doorways or around pay machines in a manner causing or likely to cause, etc., distress, annoyance, whatever. And I'm just really concerned. I know that wording might have been slightly changed. I couldn't find the exact changes, but this could be anyone. It could be a group of young people sitting on the floor because they can't find a seat. It could be buskers that some people feel is too loud, but others are really enjoying. It could be people exercising their people to protest and lie down in front of Barclays Bank. So I just wonder what your view is on those phrases and how they sit within a human rights context. I'm just worried it's something we're going to let happen and then something's going to happen to somebody and we're going to turn around and say, how did we let these powers come along?
We're pretty short of time. That's okay. No, I mean, do you want to have a quick response to that? Or yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we've heard what's been said. And some elements around this is understanding what the PSPOs are about and when they'll be used. And just referring back to everything that Ed and Ryan has said is that they will only be used in a proportionate way. And there'll be a distinct level of discretion around all the changes if they are coming in. Now, new to Ed and Ryan is the fact that actually we are going to take a bit longer to consider the full human rights issues and equalities issues that will be brought along by this PSPO. So we want to reinstate what was there before as a priority and then look in a bit more detail and listen to feedback on the rest of the changes. So we recognise that actually what we had before was working. We need to get that reinstated as soon as possible on the 2nd of December. But we are going to recommend to our executive members a slightly different approach to take a little bit more time so that ahead of the summer, we've got a fully consulted analysis of how people will be affected going forward. And also, I think an important part of this, as I started with, is to educate everyone what the changes actually mean, so that when we're getting feedback, it's feedback on well understood grounds that we're making the changes on. So we have listened.
Do you have anything to add?
Oh, thanks, Pauline. And yeah, I think all I'd add is to say that I get that the language can sound a bit draconian, but that's really because it's lifted from the legislation, which was probably drafted, I don't know when, but probably some time ago. So it's just picking up on Pauline's point, it would be exercised with discretion, and that's really the important point, that it's not a one size fits all. It's not a blanket approach. It would be only used when somebody was really causing annoyance to other people, and we'd had complaints. For example, it wouldn't be that we'd be saying, you know, we want to. The example that you gave of you know, young people sitting down on the floor, we wouldn't be then sort of stepping in, and you know, unless there was something that was really concerning about that where we felt we had to. But yeah, the discretion would be used in applying the new powers were they to be agreed.
Okay, thank you. We have 1 minute. So in terms of any other business, I'd just like to remind people already know, but tell those of you who don't, that on the 10th of December, we do an initial online meeting where we present the provisional findings for the indicator report for this year. And we've got an awful lot of food for thought from today. And thanks to all the presenters for really valuable inputs, and for people attending both in person and online for their questions and for the discussion. Hope to see you all again next year. Thank you all very much.